Don't touch those papers. Not yet. The paralegal's whisper stopped me cold as I reached for the pen. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes carrying something I recognized from 30 years in the field, the particular fear of someone who knows exactly what kind of trouble they're standing next to. I pulled my hand back, and what I learned in the next 2 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about my own daughter. The call had come on a Tuesday morning in October, when the Dallas air finally decided to behave like fall. My daughter's voice on the phone, warm and organized the way she'd been since she was 12 years old, telling me that Gerald Simmons, the estate attorney she'd chosen for me, had time that afternoon if I could make it downtown. Routine stuff, she said. Just updating the beneficiary designations on the retirement accounts, making sure everything was in order. I told her I'd be there at 2. I'd spent 31 years as a special agent with the FBI, most of it working financial crimes out of the Dallas field office. I'd retired at 62 with a commendation and a bad knee from a foot chase in a parking garage that I probably shouldn't have attempted at 58. I knew how money moved when people tried to hide it. I knew how documents got altered and why. I knew the smell of a scheme the way a farmer knows rain coming. Something shifts in the air before you can name it. But knowledge doesn't protect you from your own blind spots. And my daughter was mine. Rachel had moved back in with me 14 months earlier. She was 36 then, coming off her second failed attempt at making the interior design business work. The one Marcus had convinced her to start using $45,000 I'd given them as a wedding gift 6 years ago. Marcus Webb, my son-in-law, the man who had somehow held down fewer legitimate jobs in 6 years of marriage than I had parking tickets in 31 years of federal service. He came with her, of course. He always came with Rachel. I'd given them the downstairs bedroom because my house on Lakewood Boulevard had 3 of them, and I was only using 1. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself Rachel needed stability while she figured out her next step. I told myself a lot of things in those first months that I stopped telling myself somewhere around month 4, when I noticed Marcus had moved his things into my study without asking and started parking his truck in the space I used by the garage. The money had started before they moved in. Not unusual amounts at first, $1,000 here for car repairs, $2,500 there when their apartment lease fell through at a bad time. Normal family assistance. But after they moved in, the requests arrived with a frequency and creativity that would have impressed me if I hadn't been on the receiving end. Marcus needed funds for a business partnership that required capital. Rachel needed equipment for a new venture in event styling. The truck payment was behind. The storage unit with their furniture was about to be auctioned. Each story was different. Each urgency was real. I gave because she was my daughter, and because her mother had been gone 11 years, and because I didn't fully understand yet what I was watching happen in my own home. By the time October arrived, I had given them somewhere north of $60,000 in 14 months. The law office of Gerald Simmons occupied a floor in a glass tower on Commerce Street, the kind of office designed to communicate trustworthiness through furniture. Dark wood, leather chairs, diplomas positioned at eye level. A receptionist who called me by name when I walked in, which meant someone had described me or shown her my photograph. I sat in the waiting area and checked my phone. Rachel had texted, "Hope it goes smoothly. We'll celebrate after." I didn't know what there was to celebrate about updating beneficiary forms, but I put the phone in my pocket and waited. The paralegal who came to escort me back was somewhere in her late 40s. Efficient posture, hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under her arm. She introduced herself as Janet Cole and led me down a corridor toward a conference room. The walk took maybe 30 seconds. Halfway there she slowed, let the gap between us and the receptionist's desk grow, and leaned close enough that I could hear her without her raising her voice. "Don't touch those papers. Not yet." Her hand pressed briefly against my forearm. "You need to read everything before you sign. Everything. I mean all of it." I looked at her. She was staring straight ahead, walking normally, her expression arranged for any camera that might be watching. "What's in the papers?" I asked, keeping my voice as low as hers. "Just read them." She pushed open the conference room door. "Every line. Don't let anyone rush you." Gerald Simmons stood when I entered, a man in his mid-50s. Silver temples, practiced sincerity in his handshake. He gestured to the chair across the table and launched immediately into a warm explanation of what we were there to accomplish. Simple modernization of my estate documents, he said. My existing will was outdated. The retirement account designations hadn't been touched since my wife passed. There were also some protective measures worth considering given my age. Standard stuff. The folder he slid toward me held a stack of documents, at least half an inch thick. "Take all the time you need," Simmons said, in the tone of a man who expected me to flip to the signature lines. I started from the first page. It took 11 minutes to find it. Buried in the third document, a durable power of attorney, written in the particular language attorneys use to make something extraordinary sound administrative. The language granted Rachel complete authority over my financial accounts, my real estate, my medical decisions, and my personal property in the event that I was determined to be. And here was the phrase that stopped my breathing: exhibiting cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia as assessed by a licensed clinician. I kept my face neutral. 31 years of interview rooms had given me that much. I turned back 2 pages. The assessment referenced was already attached, a neurological evaluation dated 3 weeks prior from a Dr. Arthur Belk at a memory care clinic in Plano. His conclusion: mild but progressive cognitive impairment. Recommendation: supervised financial management. I had never met Dr. Arthur Belk. I had never been to a memory care clinic in Plano. I had not been assessed, examined, or evaluated by any clinician in the past 3 years except my cardiologist, who had told me in August that my blood pressure was excellent for a man my age. My hands stayed flat on the table. I turned another page. The will revision was there, replacing the existing document I'd had drafted 8 years ago. My house, my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, everything structured through a trust controlled entirely by Rachel, with Marcus Webb named as co-trustee. "Everything clear so far?" Simmons asked. "Getting there," I said. I was thinking about something Janet Cole had done as she set the portfolio down in front of me. A small gesture, almost invisible, she'd turned the folder so the edge aligned perfectly with the table corner. 30 years reading body language told me it was a signal, not a habit. I glanced at the portfolio. The leather edge closest to me had something tucked inside a folded piece of paper, barely visible, the corner just slightly exposed. I picked up the water glass in front of me, set it back down directly on top of the portfolio, and when I lifted the glass, I palmed the paper in the same motion. I'd done similar things during evidence collections in my 20s, and the muscle memory was still there. I folded it into my jacket pocket without looking at it. "I'll need to take these home to review," I told Simmons. "It's a lot to process." His smile held, but something behind it shifted. "Of course. That's entirely your right. Though I should mention that the window for some of these protective designations is time-sensitive. Everything's time-sensitive when someone wants your signature." I stood and buttoned my jacket. "I'll be in touch." I shook his hand. I walked out without hurrying. In the elevator, I pressed lobby, and only then unfolded the paper Janet Cole had left me. "They aren't who they say they are. The evaluation is fake. Dr. Belk retired 2 years ago. His license number was used without authorization. I've worked here 8 months. I can't stay quiet anymore. If you want the truth, call me." Below, it was a phone number. I stood in the lobby of the Commerce Street Tower for a long moment, watching the afternoon traffic on the street outside, letting 31 years of professional instinct replace the part of my brain that wanted to feel like a father. Then I walked to my car, drove to a coffee shop 6 blocks away, and called Janet Cole. She answered on the second ring. I told her where I was. She arrived 20 minutes later, still in her work clothes, the leather portfolio replaced with just her phone and her keys. She sat across from me and told me what she'd seen. She'd been asked, 3 days earlier, to prepare the power of attorney documents under Simmons's supervision. The neurological evaluation had been provided by the clients, Rachel and Marcus, not obtained through the firm. She'd pulled Dr. Belk's license number from the State Medical Board database out of routine diligence and discovered he'd surrendered his license in 2022. When she'd raised the discrepancy with Simmons, he'd told her to leave it alone. That was when she'd started paying attention to everything else. She'd made copies. She'd done it on her lunch break, using her personal phone. She pulled them up on her screen and slid the phone across to me. The forged evaluation. Email exchanges between Marcus's personal account and Simmons going back 4 months, planning the documentation strategy. A reference to a payment of $12,000 wired from an account I didn't recognize to one I also didn't recognize. And one exchange that landed in my chest like something physical. Marcus, in an email dated 6 weeks ago. Once the POA is in place, we move the retirement accounts first. The house takes longer, but by spring, we should be clear. By spring. My daughter's husband had been planning this since June. In my house, at my breakfast table, while I made coffee and handed him the sports section, I asked Janet if she would be willing to provide a formal statement. She said she'd been wrestling with that for 3 days. I told her I understood that what she'd already done took real courage. She looked at her hands for a moment, then looked back at me. "He called you the old Mark in one of the emails," she said. I couldn't stop thinking about that. I drove home the long way, along the lake, the way I used to drive when I was working a case and needed the thinking time. The water was flat and gray under the October sky. I let the rage come up the way you have to let it come before you can set it aside. Felt it fully, the particular ugliness of betrayal by someone you've loved since they were born, someone whose first word you still remembered, someone you'd sat with in a hospital at 3 in the morning when nothing else mattered. I let it crest. Then I put it away. Emotion was the enemy of precision. I'd seen it wreck prosecutions that should have been bulletproof. When I pulled into my driveway, Rachel's car was there. Marcus's truck was parked where mine should have been. Through the kitchen window, I could see them at the counter. Rachel pouring something. Marcus on his phone. An ordinary Tuesday evening. I went in through the back, told them the meeting had gone fine, that I was tired, that I was going to read for a while. Rachel gave me a hug that felt exactly like every other hug she'd given me in 36 years. I hugged her back and walked upstairs and sat in my chair with the lights off for a long time. Then I made a list, the way I used to make lists at the start of an investigation. Evidence I had, evidence I needed, actions required, in order. I still had contacts. 31 years builds a network that doesn't disappear when you turn in your credentials. I called an attorney the next morning, not Simmons, obviously, not anyone Rachel had ever heard me mention. A woman named Patricia Huang, who'd spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor before going private, who I'd worked 3 cases with and trusted the way you trust someone who's argued in front of a judge beside you. I met her at her office at 9. I put the copies of Janet's photos on her desk and watched her read through them without speaking. When she finished, she looked up. "This is fraud," she said. "Multiple counts. The forged evaluation alone is criminal impersonation of a licensed medical professional. I know what it is. And you want to handle it how? The right way. Through the system, with documentation that survives cross-examination." She nodded once. "Then we do this carefully." We spent 2 hours mapping the evidentiary structure. Patricia made calls. By afternoon, a forensic accountant she worked with had been retained to trace the financial threads between Marcus, Simmons, and the wire transfer Janet had photographed. An investigative firm she trusted received an assignment. Marcus Webb, full background, all jurisdictions, the kind of report that finds everything public, record holds. I drove home and performed the role they needed me to play. I told Rachel that Simmons had called that morning, that I was still reviewing the documents, that I wanted to understand the cognitive assessment piece better because it had surprised me. She handled the lie smoothly, told me it was just a precaution, standard practice for comprehensive estate planning, that she hadn't wanted to worry me, but her therapist had mentioned that sometimes people my age didn't notice changes that family members observed. She said it with such practiced concern that I had to look away before my face said something my mouth wouldn't. Marcus came downstairs during the conversation. He put his hand on my shoulder. I had noticed he did this often, establishing physical proximity, the low-grade dominance of a man who was always calculating his position. He said he was glad I was taking it seriously. He said it was hard to watch someone you cared about struggle and feel helpless. "Absolutely," I said. The investigative report arrived 8 days later, 83 pages. I read it in my car outside Patricia's office before I went in. Marcus Webb had a history that read like a professional biography of financial exploitation. A fraud charge in Nevada dismissed on procedural grounds. A civil judgment in Colorado for $31,000 that he'd never paid. 3 separate women in 3 states who had filed and then dropped domestic complaint paperwork, the pattern that investigators recognize as a man who knew how to manage his legal exposure. And casino records. Significant casino records. Las Vegas, Oklahoma City, Shreveport. Total documented gambling losses across 4 years, approximately $92,000. The money I'd given them over 14 months, I understood now exactly where it had gone and why it was never enough. Patricia added the report to the file. The forensic accountant had traced the $12,000 wire to an offshore payment service frequently used in document fraud operations. Gerald Simmons had not been careful enough, because he'd been working with amateurs who didn't understand that federal investigators know how to follow money in ways that amateur criminals don't anticipate. "We're ready to involve law enforcement," Patricia said. "Not yet." She looked at me over her glasses. "They haven't fully committed," I said. "The documents weren't signed. The accounts haven't been moved. I want them to take one more step, something that can't be walked back." Patricia considered this the way a prosecutor considers the difference between a good case and an airtight one. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe less. They're going to push for a second meeting with Simmons. And if they escalate in a different direction, I thought about Marcus's hand on my shoulder. About by spring. Then we move sooner. I went home and began the performance in earnest. At breakfast, I asked Rachel twice what day it was. The second time, 3 minutes after the first. I left my wallet in the living room, found it with confusion. I missed a step going upstairs and grabbed the railing with the exaggeration of someone whose balance I wanted them to question. Small things, precisely calibrated, delivered with just enough irregularity to feel organic. Rachel started leaving pamphlets on the counter. Memory care communities in Plano and Frisco, glossy and pastoral, filled with photographs of white-haired residents smiling at activities coordinators. I picked one up at dinner, leafed through it with mild curiosity, put it down without comment. The look she exchanged with Marcus over my head, I saw it in the window reflection. 3 nights later, I heard them through the wall of my study. The same thin drywall I'd grown up understanding carried sound. My phone recorded silently from the bookshelf where I'd placed it before going to bed at 8:30, earlier than my habit, so they'd assume I was sleeping. Marcus's voice, confident now, unguarded. "Once he's in a memory facility, we get named immediate trustees." Simmons said 60 days, max. Rachel, quieter but not quiet enough. "I just want to make sure he's okay." "He's fine. He'll be fine. They're nice places." A pause. "The Lakewood house alone is worth $780 right now. Market's still crazy. $780,000. My home of 22 years, reduced to a line in a calculation." Rachel's voice dropped lower. I pressed my ear to the wall. What if he figures it out? Dad was FBI. He's not. He's 64 and he calls me by the wrong name half the time. Marcus. Dismissive. He's not the man he used to be. I saved the recording, backed it up to 2 locations, and sat in the dark for a while. My daughter knew. Not the details, maybe not the full scope of what Marcus had organized with Simmons, but she knew it wasn't legitimate estate planning. She knew, and she'd handed me the pamphlet and watched my face for signs that I was declining. And she decided that $780,000 was worth the cost of whatever she was doing to herself to get there. I thought about the girl who used to fall asleep in my lap during baseball games, her sneakers still on, her hair smelling like the pool. I thought about driving her to college and standing in the parking lot afterward, not quite able to leave, extending every goodbye another 5 minutes. I thought about calling her from the Houston field office the night her mother's diagnosis came back and hearing her cry and wishing I was there instead of there. I put those memories away. They didn't belong to the person on the other side of the wall. The following Monday, Rachel told me over breakfast that Simmons had an opening Wednesday, and that it would really be better for everyone if we could finalize the paperwork before the end of the year. I told her that sounded fine. I told her I'd go Wednesday afternoon. I called Patricia from my car. We were ready. Wednesday morning, I drove to Dallas Police Headquarters on South Lamar. Patricia had arranged the meeting through a contact in the financial crimes unit, a detective named Rojas, who'd worked her cases before and who'd reviewed our evidentiary package the previous week. He met me in a conference room with two colleagues, and I walked them through the documentation in the order that would make the most sense to a jury. The forged evaluation, the fraudulent license number, the emails, the financial trail, Janet Cole's statement, and the recording. Rojas asked 3 questions. Clear, precise, the questions of someone who already understood the structure and was filling in gaps. "We can have officers at the law office Wednesday afternoon," he said. "Arrest during the execution of the scheme. That's what I'd like. You understand that means letting them get to the point of asking you to sign." "I've run deeper operations than this," I said, not unkindly. He nodded. "Wednesday at 2. I went home that afternoon and found Marcus in my kitchen eating the leftovers I'd been planning for lunch. He asked how I was feeling. He said he'd noticed I seemed steadier lately, which he delivered with such transparent hope that it would have been almost comic under different circumstances. I told him I was sleeping better. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his food. I stood there looking at him, this man who had moved into my house and eaten my food and spent my money and planned to turn me over to a memory facility while he inventoried my real estate, and I felt nothing except mechanical calm of someone counting down to a specific time. Wednesday at 2. The offices of Gerald Simmons felt different when you knew what you were walking into. The receptionist smiled. Janet Cole was not visible. I hoped she'd had the good sense to find a reason to be elsewhere that afternoon, and Patricia had advised her to take a personal day. Simmons met me in the same conference room, the same dark wood and leather chairs, and he laid the same folder in front of me. Rachel was there this time. She sat to my right, attentive and slightly tense, the way she'd looked at school presentations when she was young. Marcus hadn't come. I noted the absence. Simmons explained the documents again. Beneficiary updates, protective designations, the power of attorney provisions, the trust structure. He turned to the signature page with practiced efficiency. He set a pen on top. I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, that I knew she didn't intend me to see something shifted in her expression. Not guilt exactly. More like the particular discomfort of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for it to be over. "Rachel," I said. "Dad?" I pushed the folder back across the table without touching the pen. "I know about Simmons and Marcus," I said. "I know about the wire transfer. I know about Dr. Belk's retired license. I have the emails." The color left her face. Simmons started to speak. The conference room door opened before he got to the second word. Detective Rojas entered with 2 officers and a woman from the DA's Financial Crimes Division who I'd been told would be present. Rojas looked at Simmons with the flat, professional patience of someone who had done this many times before. "Gerald Simmons, you're being detained for questioning in connection with fraud, conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, and criminal impersonation of a licensed medical professional." He turned. "Rachel Webb, you're being detained for questioning in connection with the same matter." Rachel looked at me. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you can't find words for what you're feeling. And I looked back at her the way I had learned to look at people in interview rooms over 3 decades present, attentive, and entirely without rescue. "The attorney being present doesn't change anything," I said quietly. "What's happening is real." She was crying before they walked her to the door. I sat in that conference room for another 40 minutes, giving my formal statement to the detective, walking through the timeline, confirming the documentation chain. When it was finished, I thanked Rojas. He shook my hand and said the kind of thing law enforcement people say to each other when a case is well constructed, a brief professional acknowledgement of work done properly. I drove home. The house was empty for the first time in 14 months. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum and the afternoon traffic outside, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a space that is finally only yours. Marcus Webb was arrested 3 hours later at a poker room in Irving that the casino records had taught us was his 3rd location of the week. He had $140 in his wallet. Patricia called to tell me, and I thanked her and opened the bottle of whiskey I kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the good one I'd been given at my retirement and hadn't touched because I'd been waiting for an occasion that felt right. I poured one glass. I drank it at the kitchen table while the sun went down over Lakewood Boulevard and the last light moved across the floor the way it had been moving across that floor for 22 years. The following weeks moved through the legal system with the mechanical progression that anyone who has worked inside that system understands. Simmons retained a criminal defense attorney and began cooperating within 4 days, providing documentation of the arrangement with Marcus in exchange for consideration. The forensic accountant's findings were turned over to the IRS, which identified 2 additional tax irregularities in Marcus's offshore payment activity. The forged evaluation was referred to the Texas Medical Board. Rachel was charged with conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse and fraud. She posted bail using money I had no control over. I learned later it came from a loan against a jewelry collection I hadn't known she still owned. She retained her own attorney. Patricia filed the civil complaints in parallel, which meant that every dime of my money that could be traced to Marcus's gambling losses, the $12,000 payment to Simmons, and the preparation of fraudulent documents would be subject to civil recovery. I changed my will in November. Patricia drafted it herself, and I had it witnessed by 2 of her colleagues. The house and the majority of my estate went to the Fallen Agents Memorial Foundation, an organization that supported the families of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty, people who understood what it meant to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. Rachel would receive $25,000, a number I chose not because it felt appropriate, but because completely excluding her might have complicated probate in ways that weren't worth the legal effort. The documents were filed with the county the same day. I changed the locks. I had the entire house swept for any devices Marcus might have planted, which was perhaps excessive, but felt necessary given what I now understood about his thoroughness. I repainted the downstairs bedroom and turned it back into a guest room. A cleaning crew came on a Thursday, and I went to the hardware store while they worked, not because I couldn't tolerate the cleaning, but because I didn't want to be present for the removal of the last physical traces of them. When I came back, the house smelled like something beginning again. Janet Cole had left Simmons's firm the Monday after the arrest, which I learned from Patricia. She was negotiating a settlement for wrongful pressure regarding her employment, which I suspected would go well for her given the broader investigation. I called her to ask how she was doing, and she told me she was relieved, but also tired in the way that doing the right thing under pressure leaves you tired, and I told her I understood that feeling from personal experience. "You could have just walked out that day," I told her. "You didn't have to leave me that note." "I know." A pause. But I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be when it was over. That was, I thought, the best possible reason for any action. The criminal proceedings stretched into the following year, as criminal proceedings do. Marcus entered a guilty plea in February, after the full weight of the financial trail became apparent, and his attorney informed him that going to trial would produce a significantly worse outcome. He was sentenced to 26 months in federal prison on the conspiracy charge, with restitution of the amounts that could be documented as direct theft, from me, $62,000 and some change. He would emerge from federal custody with a felony record, no assets, and whatever remained of whatever he'd told himself he was. Rachel stood trial on a lesser conspiracy charge. She was convicted on 2 counts and received 18 months of supervised probation, 400 hours of community service, and a permanent record. Her attorney had argued diminished judgment due to influence by a manipulative partner, and the jury had given that argument partial weight. I sat in the gallery for both days of the trial and watched my daughter try to explain, under oath, the specific calculations she had made about my life and what it was worth to her. I did not feel nothing. That would be dishonest. But what I felt was something I'd learned to live with in 3 decades of sitting across from people who had done irreparable things, a recognition of the truth, without the luxury of wishing it were otherwise. After the verdict, as the courtroom cleared, Rachel turned once and found my face in the gallery. She held my eyes for a moment that lasted long enough to contain everything that could not be said between us, and then looked away. I drove home through a Dallas afternoon that had finally decided to commit to spring. The temperature exactly where you want it, The light at that particular angle that makes the city look like a place worth staying. Patricia called while I was still in the car. The civil recovery from Simmons's liability policy would cover approximately 80% of my documented financial losses. The remaining 20% was gone, absorbed into poker rooms and casino floors in Nevada and Oklahoma, unreachable and irretrievable. I told her that was fine. I had not given that money expecting to get it back. I had given it because I was a father, and fathers give. That, it turned out, was something my daughter had counted on. She had not been wrong about the fact. She had only been wrong about what it would cost her. I pulled into the driveway on Lakewood Boulevard in the late afternoon, the spring light moving through the front windows the way it always had, the oak tree in the yard showing its first cautious leaves. I sat in the car for a moment before going inside, not because I was hesitating, but because there is a specific quality to arriving home that you appreciate differently once you understand what it means to almost lose it. I had spent 31 years believing that justice was an institution, something maintained by systems and courts and the slow machinery of law. I still believed that. But I also understood now that it required individuals willing to work within those systems, with patience and precision, to document carefully and build methodically, to resist the shortcuts that emotion offers, and trust the process, even when the process was slow and expensive, and sometimes incomplete. What I had not done was break a single law, had not threatened anyone, had not manipulated or deceived except in the narrow performance of the sting itself, which Patricia confirmed was within the bounds of what law enforcement routinely employs. I had built a case the way I had built cases for 31 years, with evidence and documentation and the slow accumulation of irrefutable fact. They had believed I was past my useful years. That time had softened my judgment and slowed my thinking, and left me accessible to anyone who moved quickly enough. Marcus had called me the old Mark. He had said I was not the man I used to be. He was wrong in every direction that mattered. The man I used to be was more patient now, better at waiting, more certain of what he was willing to accept and what he was not. The years had not diminished those capacities. They had concentrated them. I went inside and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the yard for a while. The yard that was mine, in the house that was mine, in the life I had built across 4 decades of work and loss and ordinary persistence. No voices behind walls. No calculations made about my absence. No one counting the rooms or estimating the square footage. Just the coffee and the light and the sound of the neighborhood going about its evening. I thought about Janet Cole and her question about the kind of person she wanted to be. I thought about Rachel at 8 years old, asleep in the back seat on the drive home from Thanksgiving. Her face slack and unguarded the way children's faces are when they trust the person driving. I thought about what it costs to love someone without conditions and what it costs to stop. I finished the coffee and washed the cup and set it in the drying rack. Then I went to my study, opened the book I'd been meaning to finish for 2 months, and read until the light was gone. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps more people find us. And if you want to hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for being here.